Hi everybody, this is Jim from Detroit. I'm on the 46th floor of the Marriott recording this. That's the river you can see in the background, and on the other side of the river is Canada. That's Windsor. So I'm ready to talk to you about Chapter 7 from the book on play, story, and school. And I'll be posting the quiz items as soon as I can. As I mentioned, I'm going to try to make this quiz a little bit shorter than the previous ones. So let's just start right in. The title of this chapter, Emotional Breaches in Play and Narrative. If I were to just throw in an everyday term to go with that idea of emotional breaches, it would just be outbursts. I think that's generally what he's talking about here, is this idea that emotion pushes its way through really quickly into any sort of play scenario. And that's what this whole chapter is about the fact that play tends to have this really highly charged emotional content, and that's partially what makes kids want to do it so frequently once they get into it. And later on in the chapter, he does talk about how in many cultures kids don't have opportunities to do that, but that in our modern Western society, where we push back on forcing kids to start taking part in adult work and so on, we've created this space for things to be more playful. And we have a lot of conflicts as adults with that, because as is discussed here in the chapter, so much of play is about the tension between being out of control and in control. And for us as educators, we want to provide kids a safe place to be, and we have this tension between wanting them to be creative and to express themselves, but also to have everything be in control. And that's one of the reasons that I'm taking you to the playground, is to help you start to figure out how to manage that tension between being in control and having these emotional outbursts, so that you can see that there's always potential for difficulty with play, but it's one of the most human things that we can do inside of an institution, is to help kids figure out how to manage this tension. So I'm on page 162, past that typical introduction material that we usually see in this book, where they talk about their relationship to Greta Fine, where they first met her, and so on. But on page 162, we move into the idea that affect is one of the key areas that we're talking about here. And it's generally boiled down to emotion, but affect is a little bit more complicated than just emotions that we have. It includes motivations as well as feelings. So our intent, our desires, and our feelings are organized or disorganized through our thinking. But there's that relationship between the thinking area of the brain, which is more out in the cortex, and then, as he talks about later on in the article, the deeper area of the brain, right down in the center, that's that older emotional center that's about risk and safety, the amygdala. That tension between those two areas of the brain tends to be what we talk about as affective. A-F-F-E-C-T. So it's not effective, like it's efficient or anything like that. It's affect. And it's the whole area of thinking that we tend to ignore in education. We only tend to look at the affect when kids are in trouble or causing trouble. And that's to our detriment. If we don't think about kids' motivations and intents and emotions all the time, we're going to have all of these breakdowns around us, and we'll end up trying to put the thumb on kids to control them, rather than having a vibrant, emotional, social community that we're involved in. So, let's see. So I'm in the quotation there that he gives from Greta Fine, that big block quotation. Although divergent thinking is characterized by novel and original associations, most theorists exclude the bizarre or inappropriate associations. So even psychologists, developmental psychologists, people who do research on play, have tended to ignore this power, this emotional power that kids want to know, feel, and express when they're playing, and ignore it in favor of the things that seem more rational and useful and so on. And we can be guilty of that in education, but we can also just do better with it than a lot of people have done. We don't necessarily ignore those things. We figure out how to participate and how to work on it, how to help keep it from getting dangerous, but letting the kids have a modicum of tension between being in and out of control. So Down a little bit further, there's this clear idea that affect, when kids are really dealing with those deeper emotions, that there is often a departure, that they need to move away from what's most real into fantasy. And that's the key thing here, is that play is this departure oftentimes from the reality into the fantasy. And what Sutton Smith is telling us here is that the intensity of emotion that we bring into play is what stages that. It's the intensity of the emotions that we're trying to deal with that takes us away from the most real rehearsal situations of real life and over into a fantasy area. So, and that, as mentioned just another paragraph down, that's what makes play interesting. It's what makes it memorable, and it's what makes kids want to talk about it and tell about it and do it over and over again on the playground, find people that they like to play with, and so on. So looking for this balance between how play and stories show us what kids are doing is what this chapter is all about. So I can't emphasize enough, like it says at the top of page 163, that play oftentimes is just not relevant in a practical sense. It doesn't have this immediate application where we can say, well, the kids are pretending like they're welding things. Of course they're going to become welders. They're imagining the skills that they would need and so on. Or that if the kids are playing doctors, like, oh yes, they're practicing normal medical skills there. It's not like that. The play that kids rehearse, even when they bring in practical roles and objects and so on, the point here is that Sutton Smith is noticing that despite all of that content that might look and feel real in the play, there's an emotional exaggeration that kids are looking for that moment of the outburst. And the everyday doesn't, may stage that, but it's not the point of it. So vocabulary word on page 163, the last paragraph before the break there, their ludic construction of reality, lewd or ludic or ludicrous. Ludicrous might be one that you recognize. That's the Latin for play. So you'll often see people in an academic article on play talk about something being ludic and so on. So the key thesis then is right at the very end of that section, where it's we're pursuing the paradoxical emotional nature of play and narrative. So what's the paradox? What's the conflict or the contradiction here? Is it the conflict between language and emotion? No, it's in the very next paragraph, the play as order or disorder, right there in the, well, it's not going to show up forwards for you, but right there in the header, play as order or disorder. And just to put that in clearer terms, he's seeing the paradox of play is that it's between the messy and the neat. It's between the tidy and the disorderly and so on. And that movement back and forth between order and disorder, the messy and the neat, that ends up being the tension that's there in play. So a lot of psychologists have tried to talk about play as being an orderly process, and they justify play usually by saying play is rehearsal for being grown up. If any of you have seen a Montessori school, Montessori schools are populated with lots of little versions of grown-up stuff. They have like the entire kitchen set up. That's a Montessori invention. Little tiny brooms, all of the things that you can use to enact adult life are there in a Montessori setting. And there's that sort of assumption by many teachers in a Montessori system that it is a rehearsal, that you give kids opportunities to rehearse what is done in adult life. When you flip over to page 164, you have this conflict between this tidy sort of I'm a mommy and I'm going to be sweeping up the kitchen and sort of a thing, where the same person might immediately take that broom and stick it down between her knees and say, and now I'm a witch. And there's this tension where you put people into play with real objects even, that they might switch from the tidy to the messy, from the light to the dark, and so on. So that first those 2 pages in that section is Sutton Smith showing you that even among the psychologists and theorists who study play, there's this big tension between the messy and the neat. People who want play to be rehearsal for adulthood, and people who are noticing that play is really a breakdown or a pulling apart of the things that people would see as valuable in adulthood. So The next section, play is paradoxical. This is where he kind of really gets into that theme of the messy versus the neat. He starts that out with a reference to a story that you may not have caught there. He says the epistemological ludic elephant. That's a reference to the story of the blind men who walk up to the elephant, and by touching each of its parts, they say things like, the one who's touching its leg says, "Oh, yeah, it's a tree. I can feel its trunk." The one who is grabbing its tail says, "No, I believe I've found a rope." The one who is grabbing its tusks says, "No, I believe that we've found a spear here," and so on. So there's this story about all of the psychologists, everybody who studies play, seems to get it a little bit wrong because they're only looking at one piece or part of it. So he's trying to be a little bit more holistic here in this next paragraph to kind of pull things together for us. So vocabulary here, epistemology is the area of philosophy that is the study of knowledge and how knowledge works, what it is. And then his big question here is, what is play in terms of the human mind? So again, getting back to the thesis, there's a nice quotation there right before talking about Gregory Bateson. All play harbors contrary activities, and that's its central character. So it's contrary, it's contradictory, it's about struggle, and so on. So, and he talks about Bateson's idea that the playful nip connotes a bite. We watched videos of mammals playing with each other, that when puppies or wolves or tiger cubs or whatever among higher animals are playing with each other and they bite, they do something not only with the bite that doesn't make it go all the way in and become a real bite, but they also are playing with their postures and so on so that their partners know that it's just play and not serious fighting. So sometimes it goes too far. That's the key thing at the bottom of page 164, is that often we see that while playing that there actually does become a bite and so on. So there are risks inherent in letting people go into this kind of play. The next page, 165, he starts to get into the idea that sense and nonsense are part of this tension that's going on. That sometimes when mimicking adult life, even when kids are kind of acting something out that looks like, oh, they're pretending like they're adults, if you watch more closely the emotional content of it, you'll often see that the kids are mocking or making fun of adults and what they do. So I've often seen kids play like they're newscasters, and as they get into the newscasting, it's just this a ludicrous attempt to show how stupid and boring the news is frequently, and how they don't really get it, but that they understand the little scripts and norms of what it means to be an anchor woman or an anchor man working in the news. So he talks about Ring Around the Roses. You may not have recognized the version where they say a tissue instead of ashes, ashes. That's the English or Aussie version of Ring Around the Roses. Kind of fun to think about because we often hear about that connection between Ring Around the Roses and the Black Plague. But the original versions don't have anything to do with the ashes and so on. It's been something that's been debunked for a long time, but we tend to hear about it pretty frequently. If you see there's a citation, Sutton Smith, 1959. What does that citation go to? What article? What book? It's a good thing to maybe go back and look at. Where did he first record some of that play with Ring Around the Roses? What he got to in that, though, in talking about Ring Around the Roses, is this idea that in any sort of play, and this was a specific example, the kids kind of worked themselves into a chaotic frenzy as they were trying to hold hands and get the game going fast and have it be a little bit more fun. But then at the very end, they would all try to fall down at exactly the same time. And so he was able to use that example to show us that that outburst of out of control and then the getting back into control is something that is characteristic of play, and that push between being in a frenzy and then getting back and falling all down at the same time, that is pretty characteristic of the tension that he's talking about, the paradox. So the contradictions and the conflict, this tension between in control and out of control, the messiness and the order, all of that, that's what kind of helps Brian Sutton Smith bring play and so on over into the humanities, rather than thinking about it strictly from a psychological point of view, you'll often see him talking in very literary terms, like a literary critic or somebody who really just loves stories is the kind of person he's going to be. So next section, paradox of emotions. The amygdala is first brought up here, basic neurology, that this is the area of your brain that goes way back into the millions of years and relates you to all of the other animals that have a system that monitors risk and safety. So it's constantly monitoring risk and safety, and it has laminar connections. It has dendrites that reach out to your cerebral cortex, so that this deep risk and safety area of your brain has wires going out to the area of your brain that controls thinking and the more rational approaches that we think of as being a modern man. So the fact is that amygdala down deep in your brain, and he points this out with the reference to Ledoux here at the very bottom of that first paragraph, is that the amygdala actually has a controlling or a governing function, that if your brain perceives things as being at actual risk, it sends messages out to the cortex that are really hard to control or stop. So that's kind of what play is this sending of those messages of, oh, we're being bitten back out to the cortex, and what do we do? And so there's this sending of those messages. If we really perceive actual risk, that amygdala has the ability to go out to the rational areas of your brain and almost shut them down. You've experienced that before when you freeze, when your brain says, we are not safe here, and you immediately get into that fight or flight sort of approach to things. So that's the fascinating thing about play, is that because you have those wires going back and forth between the rational you and the emotional risk and safety you, that we have as humans and even other animals, as we've talked about, many of the higher mammals play like we do, that we have this movement back and forth between that old deep area of the brain and the newer thinking areas of the brain, where we're able to get into a different frame of mind. And that term is often used, a play frame, that we get into that play frame, or it's almost like the proscenium of a stage that sort of gets around us that says, this is play, this is not real. But we're going to have some of the outbursts that we would have with the amygdala, as if we were in real danger, as if we were being chased, as if we were being hunted, as if we were being killed, as if there were witches, as if there were ogres, all of these things that are in the traditional stories. So playfulness allows for those bursts of out of control to happen, and then we use the rational area of the brain to kind of bring them back again. So what Sutton Smith is doing inside this section is he's cautioning us away from over-romanticizing play into assuming that it's a way of controlling the life of kids, of making them into better adults and so on. That may be true, but it's also slightly risky and slightly dangerous. So I think that what Sutton Smith does get to us is that play is a way of honoring who kids are, and it's a way for us as adults of letting go. From the very beginning, working with children is this tension between holding them close and letting them go, and letting kids play freely with these outbursts and trying to learn how to manage them. That's one of the first ways that we have of trusting them and letting them go. If we let kids go big, if we let them have those outbursts of emotion, there are going to be mistakes. And there's a nice quotation on 167. Play seems to be an attempt to avoid getting out of control while providing access to the vigor and vitality of the more extreme, largely involuntary kinds of emotions. So this is something that he emphasizes here clearly, is that the spontaneous emotions, the ones that just burst out of us, is that those are completely different from the ones that are more controlled. So if you think about it, and you'll see this with yourself with the kids, the kind of laughter that you use with the kids, you'll notice whether the laughter is just a spontaneous burst of laughter, or whether it's you clearly saying, I'm going to laugh at you because I think you're being funny as kids and I want to support that. You'll notice that spontaneous laughter is one way for you and for the kids, and it's another way when you're clearly being logically and controlled, responsive laughter. So next page, 168. So we've got this inclination to believe that the more involuntary events are the more primitive, irrational, and disorderly, and he wants to debunk that. It's not that the amygdala is this way of being out of control, that area that manages risk and safety like that, it is one of the things that has ordered life for us such that we can survive. So there is often the idea that responding from the amygdala is going to be the more logical, the more orderly way to approach things, and that this nonsense might come from the rational area of the brain. So it's not one or the other. It's this weird tension going back and forth between the amygdala and the cortex, the logical and the emotional, the rational and the deep sense of risk and safety. Down into that paragraph, he talks about what play can be like. Wicked, masterful, brilliant, beastly, arrogant, egocentric. Those are the conflicts that he's talking about. One of the things that I want to point out again is that our modern addiction to TV, movies, YouTube videos tends to have to do with these conflicts of outbursts of emotion and so on. So why do we watch the cat videos? Is there not some sort of emotional connection that we feel when the cat does a particular thing on the video? It's not the most intellectual thing that we do, but it's something we do. So why do we do it? And it's playful. So let's go down to the very bottom of that. What Greta Fine would agree with is that the undercurrent of primary emotions is central to the nature of play and narrative. So what he's saying is that this breaking out, this burst out of the amygdala out to the cortex is central to what play is, and it's central to what stories are. So if we really want to know how stories work, again, if we want to have a great creative writing classroom, and again, this is the tension, we can bring play into the classroom and kind of make it academic or whatever, and do that poorly, or we can be really inviting and help kids figure out how to bring conflict of play into their classroom. So whatever the theory that you were looking at, whatever psychologists say and so on, he's coming back to this. The emotions in play are intense. The emotions are immediate, and they're important to the kids. The next section, emotional system as a genre of recapitulation. This gets into some more of the psychology, but he starts out by talking about some of my favorite folklorists. So you've got Alice Gaum, 1894. What did she write? Can you find it on Google Books? Can you see what her book looks like? I'll bring a copy into class that I got on ABE Books. Peter and Iona Opie, you've seen their work. You've got a copy of the book that she co-authored with Maurice Sendak, I Saw Esau, and Sutton Smith, 1959 and 1981. These are some of the key people who have really worked to understand kids on the playground in the past 100 years. It looks like a little over 100 years for Alice Gaum. Who are these people? Why do they want to understand play so much, and what did they write? So historical accounts of play, Mikhail Bakhtin, Johann Huizinga, Spariosu, these are some of the other key theorists who have really dug in and tried to figure out what is this thing that humans do called play. The next bits of the paragraph just bring out a connection for me. So much of this tension that we're talking about is completely and thoroughly played out in Star Trek. And I watched it when I was a young kid, and I'm not as much of a Trekkie as some of my friends are. But Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock are this tension between the amygdala and the cerebral cortex. And that if you watch the way they write scripts around Spock and Kirk in any Star Trek episode or movie, it tends to be about the difference between an emotional outburst and response and a logical reaction. And it's a great way of managing the stories, because oftentimes Kirk's emotional outburst response ends up being the way towards order and the correct way to save people and so on. And in other cases, it's Spock's logical approach that tends to get things done. And usually the scripts end up being, how do the two of these things work together? And you'll see that in other stories, not just Star Trek. Always look for that sense of who's the one that's in charge of the emotional outburst and who is the one who is in charge of bringing things back to sense and rationality. Among those senses of the emotional outburst and the rationality, we have developed signals in our behavior with other people that tell them when something is play and when it's reality. And those have a lot to do with the face, the tone of the voice, the prosody, the things we do with our hands. We have little systems of exaggeration that are supposed to cue people up to knowing when we're being playful and when we're being real.
Sometimes it's difficult to tell the difference between which kinds of emotions are being expressed. Is it the secondary, the emotions that are more out here in the brain, or is it the ones that are deeper inside? But that frame is telling us that those two can actually be going back and forth, one between the other. Let's see. There's this, again, he's getting us back to the sense that modern people, if they think about play at all, really want to talk about it in terms of its value or its approach to getting us to being better adults and so on. But as he goes on down page 169, you've got this word dark that comes up to go with the primary emotional theater that he's talking about. The clearly chosen or rational secondary forms, that they're in tension between the more dark forms of play. And flipping over to page 170, that's just telling us that in any authentic play that we find, that you're often going to see that there is no light without the dark. There's no voluntary without the involuntary. There's no order without the disorder. That all of these things are kind of in a managed tension. Some kids don't know how to manage that tension, that they burst out of control and they throw their arms around and kids get hurt. In many cases, I've noticed that these are kids who are growing up as single children or kids who have been through a foster system and don't have a lot of people to play with on a consistent basis. These are the kids who need play the most. If they're ever going to figure out how to get the outbursts managed to where they're just right, they're going to need to be able to play a lot. The major emphasis tends to be on that cognitive secondary emotion in the cerebral cortex rather than those outbursts from the primary emotions. And that's where we lose kids, is by focusing only on the cognitive piece. So because of that, many educators and many educational researchers ignore play completely. They don't value it at all. It's all academic work all the time. Or they ignore the parts of play when it becomes nonsense, just when it's starting to get interesting and actually have some of these conflicts in them. So as we get down to the bottom, it's talking about children's stories here, and he starts to move us into some of the material from his book, Folk Stories of Children. I just want to emphasize for you that where it says what is most important about children's stories, blah, 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 is that they show children's preoccupation with both primary and secondary emotional issues. That's one of the key reasons that I'm asking you to have a repertoire in traditional and personal stories, is that all of your personal stories have some sort of emotional content to them. That moment where it makes it a memorable story for you, there's something really emotional there, and that's why you tell that story over and over again. It's the same thing with the traditional stories that we learn. But we do this so that the kids actually we bring storytelling into the classroom so that the kids actually have material, that they have stories to do variations on, to tell in different ways, to emphasize this, to exaggerate that, to pull this content in, to take that content out, treating stories as if they were Barbie dolls that you can dress up and move around and put in the car and go up here and do all of these things, or as if they were Legos where you can build anything that you want, you can take it apart and do it again, all of that type of thing. That if we don't bring in a bunch of the traditional stories, kids will be missing on the Legos or the clothes that go with the doll, all of those trappings that make it fun to play with something and make it go. We need to give them some of that material and also invite in some of their personal stories so that they have that material to deal with as well. Starting on page 171, we get to the literary point of this, which is to say that stories are about trouble. And especially if you look at kids' stories, stories are just about trouble. And so what he's done here is all the way down page 171 is he went back to his book. What year was that book written? I see it right there at the bottom of the paragraph. Maybe there, where could I find that book? Oh, I flipped a couple of pages over to the references list, and I'm looking for whose last name in alphabetical order and what year was that book written. Oh, yes, there it is. Maybe there will be some questions about that. So he's taken all of these stories that he's collected, and those stories exist in long narrative form, and he's taken them and distilled them. He's taken all of the moments of trouble or conflict out. So in the first story, we've got a broke car, a fire in the house, a boy watched TV, the mother went out. This is a spontaneous story that this kid is telling, and he's just gone through and kind of highlighted all of the areas where it comes back to trouble. What I want you to notice in that first 2-year-old story is the thing that gets repeated is the mother went out. Think about the emotional content of mother leaving, walking out the door, shutting the door, and leaving you behind at home. Some of these other things may be more violent or dramatic, but that's one of the key little conflict moments there that even for a 2-year-old, this 2-year-old has a sense of literary conflict. So a couple of other things that I just underlined in looking through here. I love this one. At 7 years of age, there's a cat in the story. And what happens with the cat? The mice were poisonous. So we've got a kid telling a predator-prey story about cat and mice. The cat eats some mice, and the mice turned out to be poisonous. Deep trouble there in a piece of story that could come right out of Grimm's fairy tales. So I love the 9-year-old one as well, the very last one there. She would always write on her pants. Did you ever get in trouble for writing on your clothes or writing on your body in some way? I sometimes wonder if the 2000s huge emphasis on people getting tattoos, it really wasn't a thing until like the late 1990s. It kind of started becoming something through the mid-1990s. Before about 1992, 1993, only people that got tattoos were like bikers and sailors and the odd person here or there. And then it just became a thing for all of us. Is it because we got in trouble as kids for writing on our bodies with pens and we thought, ooh, that's something. I'd like to be doing more of that. So we get that material to go with and against. In the 10-year-old story, did you notice right up there at the top, he lived miserably even after listening to the Beach Boys. I love that. It's like it's this music that should be so pretty, and it has that sort of lilting falsetto to it that makes it really happy to listen to oftentimes. But he lived miserably even after listening to the Beach Boys. So the next piece is that so much of adult life, we've actually got a lot of money-making activities that go around this play frame. Sports, movie and TVs in particular, are huge economies. I like to emphasize that because we tend to trivialize pro sports as exclusive because of how few people are actually ever going to get to play pro sports or even college sports. But think about how, just read a few articles if you want to, on how much money has begun to change hands around fantasy football and how it's actually a way a lot of people are actually making their livings now, is this secondary economy around sports. We also tend to think that becoming a movie star is something that's out of reach for most kids, but we don't stop and look at the hundreds of people on every single movie that are in the production credits. These are two extremely viable areas of our economy and responsible for very much of the transfer of money in our economy, and we tend not to even treat those as viable career alternative or options for kids, even though hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in our country are actually working in those industries. So play is something that a lot of people make into a living. It's a safe frame. Play is. We invite the involuntary. I'm down into the conclusion here now that play is a frame where we try to make this burst of emotion something that happens inside of a place where we don't get hurt, where we don't get killed, where we don't actually get kidnapped, but we can talk about being kidnapped, all of these difficult pieces of trouble that come up in the stories and the play, that they're inside of a safer frame. I love the quotation at the top of 173 that reminds us that play is more like a prayer than a utilitarian function. It emphasizes that play is about hoping, not about planning. That kids aren't actually trying to stage their future through play, but they do have an eye on the world and what's going to be happening. So is there a difference between hoping and planning? Yeah, and there's a tip towards hope in play. So it does end out that much of play can be useful, but that's not the point of doing the play. We do the play because it gives us that tension between the outburst and the control of the outburst. As it turns out, when we're adults, being playful is actually valued in many real-life situations. So what do we do? It's that pleasurable variability that's there in play, the sort of mix and match approach to things, the imagination and so on that we value. If we're going to get those kinds of outcomes, if we're going to have playful adults who know how to bring their play into their work and do innovative and creative things, we need to give kids time to play, which means that kids need time, more time to figure out how do I do the outburst and manage it without it being dangerous for other people. He does emphasize that there are key differences in play between various world cultures and that it's not one and the same. It's not one and the same throughout history either, but that we have a unique opportunity in modern Western society where we have created a whole chunk of life between birth and about 18 years of age where we take away some of the work that adults have to do and let kids figure out life through play. But so much of the time that we spend in school is squelching that, stopping it, trying to keep the kids in control, getting them to shut up and sit down. And it's my push for you as a teacher and as we go towards the playground is to figure out how do I invite that spontaneity, the bursts of laughter, the deep emotions, the trouble. How do I help kids talk about that and bring that into the classroom? You'll have a much more interesting school year if you do this. Thanks.